that day, they ordered 200 of them. Both over the end of the war, almost 3,000 are built. It's the first multi-aircraft contract Lockheed ever had. So you kind of see some of the genius that was Kelly Johnson. Blackbird. Obviously the U-2 preceded this. On its early flights on the 4th of July, 1956 over Leningrad, 5 July over Moscow, it became very evident that one, we didn't think that at 70,000 feet you could see a U-2. Turns out you could. And the photography around those two cities and other major areas showed they had surface-to-air missiles that could reach up and probably shoot down the U-2. So out of that, Eisenhower commissions a group. They do a study. The space programs are not ready. A replacement aircraft is needed. The replacement aircraft will have 3 characteristics. It will not fly at 450 miles an hour. It will fly at 2,150, Mach 3 plus. Not at 70,000 feet, but at 85,000 feet and above. And President Eisenhower's #1 issue was, I want an airplane that Khrushchev can't see. Because after, well, this was before the shoot down of Gary Powers, but he knew that Khrushchev would probably react very badly and might consider it almost an act of war if we were overflying. And there were only 24 overflights. When Gary Powers was shot down, that was only the 24th mission that Eisenhower had approved. Out of that comes 2 programs. The A-12 is a single seat, CIA. As you can see, there's 13 built. The decision is made that with the kind of speed and the kind of equipment, we really need 2 people, and we want to be able to carry more payload to bring back more types of information. And people often bring up, isn't that kind of scary? You build 13 and you lose 5, and then you build 32 and you lose 12. Think about it. This is one of the last major airplanes built in this country with a slide rule. Because this airplane was started in 1958. And even when I went to college in 1963, they didn't give us computers. They gave us slide rules. So it was amazing what these engineers were able to create. Well, we'll talk about the last major slide rule. America's first stealthy airplane. By today's standards, the 117, if you go down there, is in a whole different category. That's a level of stealthiness that the SR did not come close to. Because you're going to see the heat picture here in a minute. When you're traveling at those high speeds, the air flowing over the airplane plus the heat from the engine is going to cause it to heat up. So you have to use titanium. And I think you'll find interesting, you know, we don't have much titanium here in the United States. So they set up frontal corporations, the CIA did in Europe, and we bought all the titanium from Russia, and they never knew who they sold it to. But then Kelly and his team had to figure out how to use it. JP7 is a very special gas. It's like the fuel that's burned on these jet airplanes out here, but their fuel ignites at -40 degrees. Because of the hot environment, the JP7, you have to get it above 180 degrees because we want a fuel that's stable at high temperatures. We have special fleets of tankers. We had to refuel every 2 hours. I'll talk more about that later. As we burn down the gas, we put gaseous nitrogen into the tanks to prevent auto detonation. There's 4 in the family. You've got the A-12, which was the leader. That was followed by 3 that were built as the YF-12A. Those were experimental interceptors. They actually performed quite well, but they decided that there wasn't a supersonic threat to work against. The missile that had been developed for this airplane eventually came up on the Navy Tomcat, the F-14. The Phoenix missile was really developed for this program. You got 2 that tried to launch drones. That was not successful. It was terminated during the test program. And then finally the SR-71 program, which was the legacy program, which you hear most about. It's a big airplane. You can see 107 feet long, 56 feet wide. it's 60,000 pounds empty, but when you put fuel on it, there's 80,000 pounds of fuel. It's quite an interesting ratio from what most airplanes are about. Because of the heating, the engine actually grows 4 to 6 inches in length and becomes 2.5 inches wider because of the temperature that's associated with it. A normal takeoff is half a fuel load, and that's because of the 12 airplanes we lost. 3 of them, 2 of them were on tests on takeoff, 1 of them was on actual takeoff, and 1 was on landing. So we were very sensitive to our takeoffs, and by reducing the weight, we were able to reduce the wear and tear on the tires and hopefully prevent future losses. These are some of the records. The first time records were created for the more international was 1974, and that's the speed run, New York to London, hour 55, and then London to Los Angeles, 3 hours and 48 minutes, because they put it on display at the Farnborough Air Show for the first time. This is what it looks like. Average temperature of the airplane is almost 600 degrees. It grows about 2 to 4 inches in length, 1 to 2 inches in width, and even in my air-conditioned spacesuit, if I put my hand against my side window, I could only hold it there for 5 or 10 seconds because the cockpit itself, since we're in a suit, we think it was around 70 to 80 degrees because my switches weren't hot or cold, but the windows were definitely hot. My side window was 560 degrees. My front windows were about 610. All 20% of the coating of the airplane was for stealth. So when the radar would strike these edges you see up there, all around there, the radar would be absorbed. It wouldn't reflect out, which made it a very difficult target for radars to pick up and to track. It's a standard round dial. This is a cockpit like a fighter's in the late 50s, early 60s, because Kelly said, I have so many great technical challenges to overcome. You pilots are just going to have to learn to fly round dials. The first time I got into the airplane, I'd already been accepted into the program. I was going through my evaluation back in the States here, and they put me in the cockpit, and I was disappointed because it looked just like the airplane I was coming out of, and I figured something that flew at these speeds would have a Star Wars type of a cockpit with all kinds of fancy stuff. That was not the case. You can see the important things to us is obviously fuel remaining. Behind the stick, it's kind of hard to see, but one of the great innovations is the cockpit's really small. They would film our mission on 35 millimeter film. And those of you that are flyers, instead of looking at a map, I could look down at the map projector and it moved at my ground speed. So it would tell me, oh, you got a turn coming up 145 degrees, you should have 12,000 pounds of fuel and whatever. All that information was on there because in that small cockpit to try to move a map around would have been very difficult. Let's go to the future. This is the F-35. I worked in this before I retired. Our young generation of gamers are going to love this airplane because that screen there is 8 by 20, and you can select anywhere up to 12 subsets wherever you want. It's hands-on stick and throttle, so all the buttons on the throttles on the left-hand side and the stick on the right, you can do practically everything you want to do. And that helmet he's wearing, that's virtual reality. On the skin of the F-35 are sensors, so you can look straight down, you can look out, there's no airplane there, because you're going to see the world around you in high-definition infrared, and it is truly magic. This is what the back seat looked like. We had no contact between us, we couldn't pass notes, we just talked on the interphone together. You can see, he could look straight down or forward. This was a radar display, ground mapping. Defensive controls, if they fired something at us, the controls were in the back. When we rendezvoused with the tanker, he controlled the back, and I'm going to talk to you about our magnificent navigation system. Here's what it looks like when it's running. The front part of the engine is not colored right here. That's about 2,000 degrees. That's about 3,400 degrees. And this extends anywhere from 30 to almost 50 feet behind the airplane. It's a tremendous sight to watch it take off at night. No engine can accept supersonic air. So it doesn't matter if it's like one of those F4s or Tomcats out there. When you go above 1.6 Mach, about 1,000 miles an hour, you've got to adjust the airflow into your engine, otherwise it can't absorb it. So this is the spike. This is the subsonic position. As you go above 1.6 Mach, it's unlocked and it'll start going backwards. So this hole here will double in size, and as it goes back, you're going to see here what happens. This is what it looks like. This is what the inlet looks like when it's subsonic. Now, as you accelerate, you see how the spike comes back and narrows the area here, so it helps compress the air. So it slows it down before it comes to the first stage. Don't worry about the mice. There's lots of things that have to take place because we're converting a normal turbojet to a turbo bypass, which is analogous to a ramjet. And it's the only airplane in the world that the faster we went, the less fuel we burn. Because when you burn fuel using the ram effect, it's that much more efficient. So I'm going to step through. This is always going on. It's air that is of no value to us, and we're dumping it overboard, very little. This is more bypass area that goes back into the afterburner area in the nozzle. This is our critical one because it comes out at 90 degrees. It's right at the face of the compressor. And you want to keep a little pressure there. You don't want to vacuum because then it can compressor stall. But if it comes too much coming out, it's going to slow you down. So we try to keep it to the minimum. And then this is a bypass we could control. When there was too much air coming out from that perpendicular, we could increase the amount that was being bypassed and drop back into the afterburner. A double delta. This is one of the first lifting bodies created. So this area forward is a lifting body. It creates 35% of the lift, which allowed us to fly at a higher altitude. And when you're flying the airplane, most airplanes fly a little bit the nose up. We were 6 degrees nose up because I'm sure you've all been on a boat at the time. It's the bow. The bow is up and the water is hitting. It's the same thing with air. The air is hitting that forebody and providing lift for this airplane. Part of the genius of Kelly Johnson and his team. You'll see down here, we had no control over our sonic booms. Just always there. Most of the time they weren't destructive. Can you imagine sometimes that we actually overthrew heads of state and purposely moved them to remind them they were doing things counter to U.S. policy? Yeah, we have some great pictures of Brezhnev talking with Fidel Castro. And the 3 days before Noriega was decided that leaving Panama might be a good idea, SR-71s overthrew his house and gave him a pretty significant boom. But probably the biggest boom that was ever created was during the Vietnam War. It was May of 1972, so you're getting towards the end of it. And 3 SR-71s crisscrossed over Hanoi and created probably one of the largest sonic booms. Now, the guys that flew those missions thought that this was a salute to the POWs, but they didn't know, and it wasn't until years later, it shows you how when you do secret operations, you're only cleared for the part that you need to know. It turned out President Nixon had directed an operation to try to rescue some of our prisoners in Hanoi. A message had been sent to Admiral Stockdale that the Navy SEAL teams in the mouth of the river, if they wanted to escape and make their way down the river, everything would be in place, and the key was listen for the sound from the heavens. So the whole purpose of those SR-71s was to let Admiral Stockdale know that the operation was in place. And they did that twice, 3 days apart. Now, I've interviewed some of the POWs from there, and they said, you know, we knew exactly what it was. And he said it scared the living daylights out of some of the guards. But you know, with a twinkle in their eye, they said to me, you know, we liked your signal, but we really loved the B-52 bombs. Because we knew the war was about to come to an end. These are good tires. These are good tires. They're good for about 15 landings, 415 pounds of nitrogen. Because if you put air in the tires during the flight, as the tires heat up, the oxygen would bond with the rubber, and you'd come back with slightly deflated tires, which would not be good to try to attempt to land this airplane. You don't have any tread, you just have dimples, that's all. But you can see the 4 airplanes we lost related to the tires and the landing gear. This was the first airplane that had an extensive digital recording system. And the whole purpose of it is you're flying the airplane is hot, the heat is causing problems to the airplane. You come back and land, I come to you in maintenance and say, this thing didn't work right, and you go out and you now turn on a perfectly cold airplane and you look at me and say, pilot error. You know, obviously you didn't read your gauges right. So by recording it through the whole flight, they could see when certain pieces of equipment were acting up. Everything we said, every time I moved a switch, it was all recorded when I did it. So there were no alibis. When you came in, it was a very honest debrief. Yes, at 2 hours in such a mission, this is what I did, and this is what I saw. To help maintenance. Now today, you and I get to enjoy with our airlines. A good share of the airlines today, those airlines are delivered with monitoring systems on board. They're one step ahead of us because many times they send a message ahead of time to where you're going to land, that there's something that needs to be fixed in this airplane before it can fly again. Just like the 117, when you build a stealthy airplane, you give up stability. So in the SR-71, that's a normal pitot here that measures airspeed. The side probe, top and bottom, this airplane is unstable in pitch and yaw. So it doesn't matter if you're hand flying the airplane or on autopilot, there's a flight control computer in the background that is putting very small inputs into the airplane to keep the airplane under control. Now with the 117, it's unstable in all its axes. The SR was only unstable in those 2. This is one of my heroes. This is Bob Gilliland. He was the chief test pilot. He flew every single one of the SR-71s on his first flight, if you can imagine. And it was 24 months after the contract was let. They took off. He took it to 30,000 feet. He flew it supersonically. That's the first time any airplane on its first flight had ever gone supersonically, and then brought it back in for a successful landing. But he was an inspiration to all of us and someone we could turn to when we saw things on the airplane that we had questions about. That was the old suit. It was a suit when they first learned the program, very much like what the X-15, the rocket people wore when they did their rocket test flights. Later on, we would migrate in, you'll see, into more normal spacesuits. You had to be a volunteer, 2,000 hours. They wanted 6 to 8 years flying experience because it was a very complicated airplane. You had to send your medical record, your personnel record, and your flight record. They would do an evaluation. If they thought you would have potential, they would bring you back. You had a 2-day astronaut's physical. You had a bunch of interviews. As a pilot, I had to fly 2 flights in a T-38, a companion trainer with a current SR pilot. And then we also had a simulator evaluation. And then you hoped that they would select you, and then your class, once you got into the program, was almost a year long. You can see this particular picture was taken, I didn't know it was taken at the time. It's early morning departure. I'm going to do a Cuban overfly, and we're waiting for the launch codes to come from Washington, D.C. But you can see I'm responsible for the airplane, the refueling. In the back, our navigator, our reconnaissance systems officer, had a lot of key things. The checklist, the navigation, the cameras, the defensive gear. And if it was a training mission, he would be making most of the radio calls. I would normally not talk to the centers. That was what his mind. He ran the checklist. These are our suits. These are Gemini suits that we had, my wife loved the program as much as I did, even though I was gone a lot. I mentioned to some people I spent about 150 days a year overseas on our operation, but we never had an Air Force fatality. With the combination of these spacesuits and a magnificent Lockheed rocket ejection seats, if you got to the place, the airplane was not controllable and there was nothing you could do. You could reach down and pull the handles and you knew that you would be safely taken out of the airplane and you'd live to fly another day. And you see, from one pilot did go out at 80,000 feet. Matter of fact, Bill Weaver, 82,000 feet doing 3.12 Mach. When the airplane came apart, they were testing something new. And it took them probably 8 to 10 minutes to get to 15,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a bigger chute opens up. Normally you would have been kicked out of the seat. He actually got thrown out of the wreckage. Just amazing that everything worked. But he landed safely in New Mexico. And his scary thing for the day, if you ever, he's now passed, but when you talk to him, he said, I survived all that, the airplane coming apart, and now this New Mexico rancher thinks I need to get to the hospital in a hurry. So I get in his helicopter and we're redlining, and he said, wouldn't it be ironic? I've escaped death from an airplane, I'm going to die in a helicopter accident because I can't convince this rancher that I don't need to get to the hospital. Because of Gary Powers being shot down and the incidents around that, it was a pretty extensive program. So I went through special training. I've had interrogations, shall we call it. I've spent hours in a black box. I've been waterboarded to give me an idea of what would happen if, in fact, for some reason I should fall into enemy hands. But almost more important than that, when we arrived, you live on base, so that if something does happen, the press can be kept off the base. My wife had a one-day course that told her all the things that would occur and all the support she would get in case anything should happen to me, which I think had a great comforting level for her to know that, because I couldn't talk to her about what I was doing. I mean, she knew I was flying a black airplane, but she didn't know the missions that we were flying. And we were flying overflights. Obviously not Russia and the Soviet Union, but we were flying other places where people had other visions of us continuing the overflight. You see 150 days a year training, extensive training into the program. You spent about 3 months in academics because there was so much unique. Probably 100 hours in a simulator. I came to the program in 1975. I had never seen a computer's flight simulator. It didn't have the visual, but it flew exactly like the airplane. So when you came around, about 4.5 months into your training, you got your first flight in the companion trainer. You'd never seen a takeoff, you'd never seen a landing, but you felt very comfortable in the cockpit that you were in. Matter of fact, in the simulator, we actually did a couple simulators in our spacesuits, so you got accustomed to what it's like trying to fly an airplane. Now, your first flight is subsonic. We're going to take you up and teach you how to refuel. When I was an instructor, that's what I do. Then I bring it back and teach the student, what does it look like to land this airplane? Because it's the first time he's going to see what that looks like. And when you're coming in at 195 miles an hour, it kind of occurs pretty fast. Once you're checked out, 3 times a month when you're home, they would try to fly us in the SR, and up to 6 or 8 flights in the T-38, which was a wonderful companion trainer. This was the advanced suit. better flexibility, better air conditioning. The suit would eventually be used by our shuttle astronauts on the first 4 flights of Columbia, because they didn't have their own spacesuits, so they borrowed 8 of ours. You know, they never returned them. I found 2 of them in museums in the Midwest, but we don't know what happened to the rest of them. But anyway, it was much more comfortable. And the nature of this suit, you put on cotton long johns because you're going to perspire a little bit. Some of you probably go into the gym sometime and want to lose a little weight. You get in that rubber garment. The garment touching you is nylon for comfort. The next layer is a rubber. It's got to inflate to provide you an artificial environment if you lose pressurization or if you had to eject. On top of that is a fishnet that's adjustable, and the outer layer is good to 800 degrees. So if you have to eject through a fireball, it's going to give you some protection. Today, a number of our fire departments are using that material. They can't stay in the fire, but it helps them buy some time per se. And I think you can all appreciate American eating habits. The suits come in 12 sizes, but they're adjustable. So our men and women that maintain the suits for us, as this time of year came around, and we're spending more time outside, they would tighten the suits up a little bit. And you know, when the big 3 came along, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, they were merciful. They would let the suits out a little bit. You see in the front, this is where the vent air comes in, your cooling air. During the flight, particularly longer flights, you could inflate the suit and look like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but you can move your arms around in your legs and get some air. I think you can appreciate if you sit there too long, there's parts of your body that like to have some more air to them. We did too, so we would inflate it. Our checklist, so that our air conditioning and our blood flow was not restricted, floated on these Velcro pads. This is our parachute harness, and this is our water survival. If you landed in the water unconscious, it would inflate and lift your head up so you wouldn't drown. Suit weighed 35 pounds. The helmet's another 10 pounds. It had a fine gold mesh. Some of you may have used it today. Turn the defog on in your car because your breath is causing the window to fog. All of us have moisture when we exhale. So without that defog, your visor, which are not to open when you're flying, would become completely fogged over. So the heat, you can feel it a little bit on your eyes. The gloves are probably one of the more interesting. You started with cotton surgical gloves, and then the gloves you see there were 2 more layers. It was a rubber liner because it had to inflate, and then it was a leather glove. So everything you touched, you had to be more careful because your sense of feel had been reduced. Dual oxygen system. Our missions were planned by people with computers. When you're doing 30, 35 miles a minute, you're not putting maps on the table and drawing lines. It's being done by computers. So we would go in, particularly if you're flying a mission we hadn't flown before, how much fuel, where are we turning, where are the divert bases, all those kind of things that you want to know about. There's a regular flight in the States that we would just file a canned flight clearance and head out to where they had our suits. On an ops mission, you could see it'd be a full briefing. They would tell us, how is the weather? Are our tankers airborne? Are there any changes in the rules? Are there any threat changes? You know, all the different things. Are there any special rules? I'll give you one example. I flew a night mission up into where the Kamchatka Peninsula comes down to Russia. There's a big ocean, the Sea of Osh. The Russians consider that their property. It's international air and water, so we would go up there. But this particular night, the instructions to me were, my tankers were going to refuel me over Japan, northern Japan, coming home. But if I could not receive fuel and could not get to Korea, South Korea, to land, I was to put the airplane in the Sea of Japan. They wouldn't tell us why, and we had to reconfirm it. But there were political things that came along that restricted us or told us things that we could do or couldn't do, which always made the time interesting. adding to the... You came in at 2.5 hours. You had to pass a physical before every flight. Most of the interested in sinus, your blood pressure, some other tests. What had you eaten for the last 24 hours? My wife became very interested in that. She wanted to know when I was flying, so she said she could prepare a good meal. She found out that a number of my flights I listed leftovers and said, no, that's not acceptable. So, an hour 15 before, you go downstairs, you put on cotton long johns. The suit is laying on the floor like a coverall. You have 2 technicians that help you with the process. You come through the suit, through the back, like you see there. Once you're in the suit, they're then starting to zip you up. The biggest seal is from your butt to the back of your neck. That's the big seal that you just came through. They're going to check. Each of us had 2 complete pressure suits. Once they get, the next thing they're going to do is you're going to put this helmet on, and you'll just it's kind of hard to see, but there's an inner face seal, because when you're flying, you're going to breathe 100% oxygen, and as you exhale, it comes down into the suit. So that is tightened, right tightly around your face. So you put the helmet on, it's tight. The last thing you put on is your gloves, because obviously if you put the gloves on, you really can't get the helmet on. It's just too hard to do. He's about to test to make sure that everything on the suit is working. They inflate you, you look like the Pillsbury Doughboys. When school classes were there, the boys particularly would like to come up and hit the suit because they thought it'd be kind of spongy, like the Pillsbury Doughboy. It's not. When it's inflated, it's fairly rigid. You come out to the airplane. It was hard for us to get a picture like this because the airplane had to have nothing around it. Any of the special gear couldn't be anywhere in the area, so I'm really glad I had this picture taken. A lot of my friends didn't do it, and to this day they wish they had. Most of the time, the flights were 2.5 to 4.5 hours, so you were in the suit 4 to 6 hours. My longest flight's 10 hours and 20 minutes. I was in the suit about 12 hours. When I got back, I was glad to get in the suit back. They literally install you in the airplane. You come up, you get in the seat, and just like the F-104, we had stirrups on our heels, which we would click into the seat. And what that would do is if we had to eject, it would make sure your heels were pulled against the seat so you wouldn't lose any of your leg as you're coming out of this very small cockpit. So it's command and response. When the person on the left does something, the person on the right writes it down. Vice back and forth. And you're sitting there with your arms on the rail, just watching to make sure that all the straps, all the connections, ejection seat, the dough washing system, all those things are in fact properly connected. We carried no other form of identification than the American flag on our shoulder and our name. Once you flew an operational mission, you could then wear this patch. And the habu is a very poisonous cobra snake on the island of Okinawa. That's where the Blackbirds were first operational. And the Air Force never named the airplane. And when the airplane takes off, and those of you who've seen it, and I wish I had a better example for you, it takes off and it climbs rather steeply. And to the Okinawans, it looked like a cobra asserting its head. So they nicknamed it the habu, and that was the name that became adopted. Anybody associated with the program would wear this patch, which you can see is the shape of the airplane with a Mach 3 plus on it. Pretty nice picture, isn't it? Your greatest sense of speed is on takeoff. When you clear for takeoff, you release the brakes, go to middle power, light the 2 afterburners, and in 20 seconds you're going to go 4,500 feet, and you're going to lift off doing 240 miles an hour. And within 2 minutes you're going to cross through 20,000 feet on your way up to your tankers. And unlike airplanes that many of you have flown, the SR-71 will not take off by itself. If you don't lift the nose at 180 knots, it becomes the world's fastest tricycle. Because it doesn't have any flaps, there's no angle on it that it wants to develop lift to get off the ground unless you pull that nose up. You see, if we were going to overfly enemy airspace, we had to be above 75,000 feet and 3.15 Mach, and our defensive systems also had to work. We did this on almost every flight. Dedicated KC-135 tankers, big 707s, Air Force tankers. You come up behind them, they transfer 1,000 gallons of fuel to you a minute. It took 12 to 15 minutes to take on your fuel. The airplane held about 12,400 gallons of fuel, so it happened pretty quickly. We normally had 1 to 2 refuelings, depending on how long the flight was. Every 2 hours we had to come down to refuel. Most refuelings I ever had was at 10 hours and 20 minutes. Well, actually twice, 5 refuelings. Refueling receptacles on the back of the airplane, you were well under the tanker from which you're looking up. This is what you're seeing down below from the pilot. You don't use it so much during the day, but these are director lights. This tells you to go forward or back, this tells you to go up or down, and you want the lights in the middle. We call them the captain's bars, because that's exactly where that boom operator, he or she, wants you, so that the pipe is properly extended, delivering fuel to you. My longest mission, that was from north of Sacramento to the north coast of Russia, looking for some submarines in Murmansk. We did not overfly it, we sat right on the border. I refueled 5 times. I took fuel from 15 separate tankers, because 2 of those refuelings were well north of the Arctic Circle. Those tankers had to fly 6 hours to get up there to be able to meet me with the gas that we needed. And they're guessing I consumed somewhere over 72,000 gallons of fuel in that flight. I wish I could take you all up. This is what it looks like at 85,000 feet. You see the curvature of the Earth. You see 350 miles in any direction. Imagine at night that the sky is absolutely a twinkle, because 90% of the stars that are up there we can't see down here because they're so faint the atmosphere filters them out. All kinds of sensors on the airplane. We have optical sensors. If I took a bunch of you out in the ramp right now and an SR flew over at 85,000 feet, doing 35 miles a minute, it would take our picture and we would see every single one of the people that were out in the ramp with me. I can't recognize your faces, but I can normally recognize men and women. Kids, that's a question. Depends how tall they are and what they're wearing. But you can see, that's the quality of the film we were delivering to our senior leaders in the 70s and the 80s. Also had radar, not radar seeing other airplanes, radar mapping on the ground. You're going to see a picture of it. And also we could pick up emitters. If a radar came up or a transmitter out to 350 miles anywhere around us. This is quickly what it looks like. This is a spot camera. Could take up about 1,800 pictures. You know, we weren't doing the Kodak, you know, turn the camera on, you know, do this. Things happen so fast. That had been pre-programmed. The big blue line, that picture is 72 miles wide. Has about the same resolution. We called it the country's camera, and that's when we turn it on or turn it off. These are radar out here. This is 2 to 4 inch resolution. This is 1 foot resolution, but you can't see people because it's radar. But you can see vehicles and you can pretty much guess what they are. This will give you an idea. In the original picture, if I had it here to give to you, you could see the stripes in the parking lot. That's the clarity of the film that we were bringing back. And this is that camera. And you see the reels of film. Imagine the film is 5 inches wide, but it's 2 miles long. And in a 1 hour flight, we can map 100,000 square miles. When I flew a special mission for President Carter, when the Saudis and the Yemenis were having a fight, that was a camera we used along the border to see where the armies were located. When you land, you then have to cut the film into 500-foot lengths in the dark room make sure it's okay, then feed it into the processor, process it, and then get the results that you have been looking for. This is the radar. You can see, you can't see things, but you can see what the ground looks like. You can see the roadway, you can see the buildings. It doesn't matter if it's day, night, weather, or whatever, because the radar looks through and collects the information for you. This is that side camera that looks out 25 miles and takes up to 1,800 images. This is the Seattle Dome up in Seattle, Washington. Again, you can see the lines on the original picture. This is like the third generation, which makes it less clear. SR operations. We did reconnaissance to keep up on what our adversaries were doing. We also did tactical, the diplomatic. I talked to you about the reminding people of what they were doing. The in your face, sometimes we would fly provocatively at particularly the Soviet Union, to get them to react to us. We'd not overfly them, but there'd be satellites overhead, other airplanes, ships at sea, and land sites, all watching us and recording everything the Soviets were doing. So we could collect a lot more data, a lot more accurately by stimulating them. These were the main operating bases. Beale home, Japan, Mildenhall. I'm only one of 2 pilots that ever took the airplane to the middle of the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. These are the trouble spots. It shouldn't surprise you, the places we had concentrated on because of the continuing issues. This is a typical mission out of Okinawa during Vietnam, coming out of Okinawa, refueling, flying over North Vietnam, refueling over Thailand, coming back, and then going back up. Some of the longest missions we flew was the Arab-Israeli War. And the Europeans would not allow us to fly out of Europe because they were afraid of an oil embargo. And France and Spain said, even if the British allowed you, we will not allow you to fly over our countries into the Middle East. So these came out predominantly out of North Carolina. Some of them were 6 refuelings, 11 hours and 20-some minutes. And when they got into the war zone, there'd be a big swing over the conflict area, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and then back out. 95% of the pictures that President Nixon used to decide what we were going to do to support the Israelis and try to bring the conflict to an end came from photography brought by the SR-71. Satellites are really hard to move, and there was no satellites that were in position to be able to collect the vital information they wanted. This is fairly typical out of Kadena, flying up back and forth along the Korean DMZ, trying to keep, I don't need to tell you, North Korea has always been unstable, and we've tried to keep track on to prevent being surprised. This is the CLO I told you about, because you had to cross over Japan, because this is Russian territory, cross over Hokkaido, go up into there, and then come back out through Hokkaido. And this is Vladivostok that you heard about. We would also visit them off the coast. Cuba, you may find this interesting. One of the last acts of President Ford when he was president, he knew that President Carter thought it was immoral to overfly other countries without their permission. So, on the day of the inauguration, an SR-71 flew over Cuba. And when it landed back in California, the wing commander had to call back to Washington and affirm that the SR was on the ground more than 10 minutes before President Carter took the oath of office. We went for 2 years where we didn't overfly anything, and then it went the other way because he realized he was missing so much and he was getting blindsided per se. I'll talk to you about one particular Cuban overflight. I did the Cuban overflight. I was coming back. My tankers were over Mississippi. I come down to refuel. And the tanker crew, we knew all the crews said, Buzz, did you read the paper this morning? I said, guys, they got me up at 2 in the morning. I went through the normal routine. Well, I have not seen the paper. Well, you got to read the paper. I said, why? Oh, we can't tell you. I said, no, come on. You got to read the cartoons. I said, why do I have to read the cartoons? You got to read Doonesbury. I said, why do I? So, Doonesbury that day in 500 papers around the country, it's Castro complaining about SR-71 overflights. Because when we go up in the Baltic, we can't fly at Mach 3 or 3.2 because we can't make the turn. At 3.0, to turn the airplane around is about 160 miles. So constantly when we fly at 2.8, that was our slow speed. It's about 1,800 miles an hour. And we make this turn. And probably one of the most dramatic, right here, Abin, Estonia, the right engine, on this flight in May of 1987, the right engine explodes. And now the airplane is crippled. They're trying to keep the airplane steady. They may have actually overflown a little bit of what was controlled by the Soviet forces at that time. They started left turn, down, calling Mayday, squawking Mayday. And our friends in Sweden pick up the call, and pretty soon realize there's an airplane in trouble. So they vector 2 of their big fighters to come out. And when the SR settles down, it's around 11,000, 12,000 feet, but that's all you could be on flying on a single engine. And the fighters, one gun at each wing. And then the next 45 minutes, the Soviets sent out 5 flights of 2 to try to intercept the SR-71. And when they get up there, and there's Swedish fighters sitting on the wing, they decide this is probably not a good idea. So as the fighters are starting getting low on fuel, the Swedes set up 2 more fighters to join on the wing, and they stayed with the crippled airplane until F-15s came out of Germany to then escort the airplane to a safe landing. It kind of goes to show you that sometimes the ones you thought were neutral can be awful supportive, but they do it behind the scenes. And sometimes people you thought were really supportive, like the French, they continue to not allow us to overfly their territory. So when I had to fly a mission for President Carter, it could have been 7.5 hours, but because the French and the Spanish wouldn't agree, I had to fly around those countries, and it was 9 hours and 45 minutes. This just shows you the northern one. The item here is the sub pins in Murmansk, but this is a long way up. We're north of the Arctic Circle, and our tankers were really stretching themselves to get up there. You come into land, you touch down, doing basically 175 miles an hour plus fuel. And just like at a drag race, you throw this drag chute out, it's like a big hand reaching out. It brings you to a nice taxi speed. Without it, it takes 10,000 feet of runway to get this airplane stopped. Our brakes were not adequate, so as soon as you landed, they put blowers on to cool the brakes down because they were always overheated. I talked to you about taking the film in, wearing cotton surgical gloves, cutting it to 500-foot lengths, going length the whole thing, and then feeding it to the processor. Why was the airplane retired? We invested a lot of money in it in the 80s. It did not have a competitor. But the Cold War came to an end, and they thought it'd be a more peaceful world, so they could retire it. It was costing $85,000 an hour to operate because of all our special maintenance, our fuels, our tanker fleets, everything associated with it. But you know what? I think the main reason it was retired, when I flew that mission for President Carter, from the time we collected that information he wanted, it was probably 36 to 40 some hours later before they saw the imagery, because it had to be flown back to the States, it had to be processed, people had to look at it. So I bet almost everyone in the audience here today has a smartphone. And think about what you do. You take a picture, you clip it, and you can send it anywhere in the world in less than a minute. And that's the world we live in. This airplane never developed daylight. One quick story, so I know Keith's going to bring it up. My first meeting with Kelly Johnson was an interesting meeting. I was a captain. I came down with the wing commander to Burbank. The wing commander introduced me to Kelly. And after about 10 minutes, he left for a meeting, left me with Kelly. Kelly and I talked a little bit. You know, I was a little nervous. That's an understatement. And about ready to leave, and Kelly looks at me and he goes, Captain, do you know who owns these airplanes? I said, oh, yes, sir. They belong to the Air Force. He said, no, they don't. They belong to me. And everything on that airplane is recorded. And if you don't follow the instructions exactly as they're written, the next time we meet, it may not be as friendly. How do you like that for your first meeting with the big boy? I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
Thanks, Buzz. Boy, you know, I hope everybody here appreciates what a treat that you just been given. Buzz knows more about this airplane than just about anybody in the world. And what a remarkable demonstration.
I was standing there. I didn't want to go back.
You know, I'm a historian, I'm an author. I write biographies about people like Bear Bryant, Joe Montana, Francis Gary Powers. And I try to make sense from a historical perspective of interesting people. And coming into this project, what I've learned about this program, kind of taking the wide view of it. What would you say is America's greatest export? Is it rock and roll? Is it the hamburger? Is it blue jeans? No. I would say it's something more fundamental than that. It's ambition. It's about dreaming big and making impossible dreams come true. To me, that's what the Blackbird program is all about. Ben Rich, the great number 2 man under Kelly Johnson, and later on, of course, the director of the Skunk Works, the guy who was responsible for the Nighthawk. He once famously said that to Kelly, impossible was a gross insult. He didn't want to hear impossible because the Skunk Works routinely did the impossible. As Buzz touched on, the innovations that came out of the Skunk Works over decades, just remarkable. Steve Justice, our friend, who was later the director of the Skunk Works, famously said that all aircraft companies have created aircraft that have set world records. Lockheed and the Skunk Works have created aircraft that have changed world history. And the Blackbird changed world history. And of course, it started with Kelly, I love this story about Kelly, even before the Hudson bomber was, which of course was a modified Electra. He came in, he was a young kid from the University of Michigan who was headstrong and confident, and he believed he knew what he was doing. And he gets to Lockheed in the early 30s, in the middle of the Depression, and Lockheed was building what would become the Electra. The Electra, of course, would become one of the first airliners, commercial airliners. And of course, was actually a modified version of that, was what Hitler took to Munich, to where he proclaimed peace in our time in 1938. So it had a storied history, this aircraft. And so Kelly gets to Lockheed, which was still a small company, just trying to pull out of the Depression in the early 30s. And he took one look at the design and he said, it's unstable. Now here was this snot-nosed kid from the University of Michigan, and he said that the Electra was unstable. And his bosses at that point must have thought, wait a minute, what do you know? You know, you're just a kid out of college. Because after all, nothing at all was riding on this airplane except the future of the whole doggone company. But you know what? Kelly Johnson was right. He was right about that. He created what something called the H-tail, which of course was, from an engineering standpoint, would become pivotal in saving the Electra. And of course the Electra became the Hudson bomber and became the foundation of Lockheed. Well, of course, in the early days of World War II, we needed a jet fighter. We found out that the Germans are working on a jet fighter. And Kelly, of course, convinces his bosses to let him go make a contract with the Army Air Corps at that point, and he does. And a pivotal step, I would say, in the history of American industrial management, not just aircraft, but industrial management. You know, Skunk Works is a noun that is applied to a lot of. Apple has a Skunk Works, Google has a Skunk Works. Everybody who's on the cutting edge has quote their own Skunk Works. Well, Kelly started this process simply because he intuitively realized that he needed control, complete control, and he had certain principles, the 14 principles, of course, that would become legendary. And what happened out of this, what started out as a little hangar that, according to legend, the first walls of this hangar were made with a circus tent. That's how fledgling this place was. But of course, it became the place of aviation legend. So what happened at the Skunk Works in the 40s and 50s was just beyond belief. Of course, the first American jet fighter, the F-104, which you can see right out there. The 104, what a cool-looking airplane. It might be just one of the coolest-looking airplanes of all time. It looks like, as one of the guys who I know who flew that, he said it was like the Corvette of jet fighters. The first Mach 2 aircraft, first Mach 2 jet fighter. So Bob Gilliland is going to come into this story. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Bob was the first guy to fly this airplane, 1964. And what did it take? What did it take? Well, all this innovation, all this remarkable engineering that took with slide rules, all this remarkable engineering, all this big thinking, it took somebody with guts and know-how and just the ability to be Kelly's eyes and ears in the cockpit. Bob Gilliland had something special. You know, he was a guy who grew up in Memphis, came from a wealthy family. He went off and served his country, went off to the Naval Academy, served his country in the Korean War as a F-84 fighter pilot. And there's several things remarkable about Bob's story. In the mid-1950s, he was brought back. He had done his duty in the war. He had been a test pilot for the Air Force at Eglin Air Force Base. And his father owned a big building in Memphis, and he said, "Son, come home and help me run this building." And he did. He was dutiful, came back, and he stepped back into a normal world. He has a 9-to-5 job, gets his real estate license, pretty normal life. And then his father dies. And he finds out that there's this hot new aircraft called the F-104, the fastest fighter aircraft in the world, Mach 2. And he finds out that Oak Ridge National Labs, because of Oak Ridge National Labs in East Tennessee, that the Tennessee Air National Guard had gotten several of these planes. Well, Bob does something that took something special. He walked away from his very safe, very predictable life, and he wrangled his way into that crew in East Tennessee to become an F-104 pilot. Migrated from a very safe world where he did not have to worry about the possibility of death every day to becoming a pilot in the F-104. Well, because of this, because he was one of the very first operational F-104 pilots, he comes to the attention of Kelly Johnson. And he becomes an F-104 test pilot for Lockheed. That's how he enters the Lockheed sphere. And very successfully. He teaches the Italians how to fly the plane. The great German ace Luther Rahl was one of his students. He taught a lot of people how to fly the airplane. And so by the early 1960s, by 1962, Bob was one of the top F-104 pilots at Lockheed, test pilots at Lockheed. But he was just getting started. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book. This is Speed, our book on Bob Gilliland. Gilliland would always remember the first time he was summoned to Kelly Johnson's office. It was in early 1962, before he knew what he didn't know. We used to call it going behind the Iron Curtain, he said, an apt description dripping with a certain irony. The precursor to this seminal moment happened several days earlier, while he was riding in Lou Schock's car, getting a lift home from putting his Mercedes in the shop for repairs. Bob was, while driving down the road, Schock looked over toward his buddy. "I think you need to come over with us." Bob was rather stunned to hear this sentence. Despite their close friendship, he knew nothing about the secret project Schock was testing. "What is it?" Bob shot back. "I can't tell you." "How do I know I want to do it?" Schock grinned. "You don't." Excuse me, "you don't." Well, Gilliland was intrigued, but suspected it had something to do with helicopters. And like a lot of you guys, Buzz, you guys don't like helicopters, so he had no interest in testing anything that went straight up. Well, Tony LeVere had also recommended him. Tony LeVere was one of the greatest of all Lockheed test pilots, and Bob's great friend. So after Schock told him that Kelly wanted to see him, Bob made an appointment and drove to Burbank at the scheduled time. It was the first time he had ever been allowed into Building 82. And inside his small office, Johnson wasted no time in getting right to the point, telling Gilliland that he'd been investigating him and he wanted to put him on this program. He couldn't tell him what the program was just yet, but he wanted to put him on the program. And he famously said, and of course Bob loved to tell this story, "I know you like that 104 and those 104 guys like you, but I've got something here that goes faster than the 104, goes higher than the 104, and goes further than the 104. And then he pushed his chair back and he said, "Let's go take a look at it." Well, Bob was just immediately, imagine that the Blackbird that you know and now know, of course it's long before it becomes black, not been made black yet. Bob gets a look at this thing being built, and you think, "Man, this is fast. I really want to fly this." But he just happened to have a little problem. Bob was very popular with the guys who sold the F-104 because he was a great test pilot, and the Italians loved him. And The Italians were paying Lockheed and General Electric, which built the engine, a lot of money for the F-104 program. So there was this corporate tug of war for Bob's services. And for a few months, the 104 people won. But Kelly Johnson never lost a battle. And so he eventually brought Bob over to the Black program, which was then, of course, at Area 51, which didn't exist. And Bob was one of the 4 program pilots on what became the A-12 and the Y-12A. And the road from there to the first flight of the SR-71, December 22nd, 1964. This is a remarkable, date in aviation history. 379 open items. In other words, things that weren't fixed yet on the airplane. Now, I don't know about you. I don't want to get on an airplane that has one thing wrong with it. Bob tested a plane that day that had 379 open items. This was, of course, it was at Palmdale. It could not be tested at Area 51 because the program had been announced by Lyndon Johnson at that point. But it's just a remarkably successful first flight. First flight to go supersonic. Almost nothing went wrong that day, but there was one thing that really opens a window into the soul of Bob as a test pilot. I'm often asked whether Bob was a daredevil, whether that's what made him a successful test pilot. Not at all. In fact, just the opposite. Bob was a guy who took calculated risks because he knew that was his job. But he understood that part of his job was doing things that the engineers might think unwise, but he knew where that line was, and he was not cavalier about it, not at all. So during the middle of the flight, all the things he's having to manage, he got a pretty ominous flashing light. Canopy unsafe. Canopy unsafe. Well, first flight of the airplane, all these things that could go wrong, you really don't want a canopy fly off on you in the middle of the flight. That would not be a good thing to happen, okay? Well, he had an option at that point. He could abort the mission, land the airplane, and there would be all sorts of things that he would not be able to test that day. But remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War. We desperately need this airplane, and Bob knows that he has to complete this mission, and he has enormous pressure on him to do the right thing and to move this program along. So what is he thinking? He's thinking, okay, I know all these guys who designed every part of this aircraft. I know the guys who designed the canopy. I think, and also he had a fantastic memory. This really helped him as a test pilot. Fantastic memory. And so he remembered one time he was in Korea and something similar happened. And so he thought to himself, okay, in a flash, by the way, bought in a flash. I think it's the same thing. I think it's just something that is pushing the mechanism up. It's a bad indicator. Now, if he'd been wrong, it could have been pretty dicey. Well, he wasn't wrong. He was right. He made the right decision. And if you talk to the guys who've gone back and, like Buzz, who studied those early flights, they know that this is really representative of the sort of pilot, the test pilot that Bob was. Because after all, all of the engineering, all of the math, In the end, you needed a test pilot to go up and see what worked and see what didn't work, and to be able to move the program forward. Well, December 22nd, 1964 was a tremendously successful and monumental day in the history of Lockheed and in aviation. But I think when you look back and you put Bob's career and that day in perspective with his airplane, it proves a lot of things, a few things. Importance of risk-taking to get anything important done. The Skunk Works was all about taking very calculated, very important risks to prove that impossible is just a word. And in the end, it took a guy like Bob Gilliland to go out and prove that idea.
When you did
And so it's really a fascinating story from this guy who, all those years ago, walked away from a very safe life
we had an accident. So and then
to
like
take
my mom,
this risky path, and is emblematic of so many great things about the country that connect him to the pioneers, to the astronauts, to anybody who has achieved something worthwhile. That's Bob Gilliland. Thank you so much.